Hey everybody. So 25 minutes, right? Okay, let's get this. So quick agenda here. I'll go through introductions in just a second. A little bit strange hearing my voice right behind me as well here, so I'll get used to that. So my name is Patrick Millar. I'm head of technology for the RiskStream Collaborative. We'll talk about what that is in a moment. And I've also got Anir Rajay in the back. He's senior manager with Accenture. They're our delivery partner for the platform side. And you see he's listed there as Camunda expert, and his team has actually elevated him to that rank. So if you were to come and visit us on site, you'd see that he has a mug with his picture on it with the title Camunda expert underneath it. So if the questions get really hard at the end, it's Anir who I'll point you to. So who are we? So the RiskStream Collaborative is or was formed out of an organization called the Institutes, who I can pretty much guarantee nobody here has heard of, although it has been around for a very long time, over 100 years, spun out of the Wharton School. And its primary charter, it's a not-for-profit, which is another interesting thing because we're a startup. So we're a startup not-for-profit, so let's figure that out. And its primary purpose is educating professionals in the property and casualty industry. So their flagship qualification is the Chartered Property and Casualty Underwriter, CPCU. So if you guys have ever dealt with an insurance professional in property and casualty industry on their business card, they'll see all these designations, and the Institutes is responsible for some of the top ones. So why would they form a startup in the technology space? So what's interesting to know about the Institutes is that they are like Switzerland in the P&C industry. And lots of things you have to be very careful of in the insurance industry because it's highly regulated. And this is one of the organizations that you'll come across, perhaps one of the most important, some might say the most important organization for helping to coordinate things within the industry. And it has a board, I think, of 50 plus seats. And many of those board members are, CEO or very senior executives of the name brand insurance companies that you would recognize. So back in 2016, there was some strategy work done, and they all recognized that, there's an awful lot of waste in the industry in terms of shared process and how we share information and how we interact together in certain business processes that, again, you will all recognize, like claims, other things like that happen. We need to get together. This is a team sport. And the unique technology they were particularly interested in was the use of blockchain, or what is now sometimes referred to as distributed ledger technology. So that's how we got formed. And as you'll guess by the name, we're a consortium, so the RiskStream Collaborative. And this is just a selection of this is the list of companies that is part of the collaborative. So the big circle, property and casualty, the smaller one, we're in partnership with a sort of cousin in the industry called LIMRA, and that's for life and annuity, so LNA stands for life and annuity. There are also some not-for-profits there, and I mentioned LIMRA already. These are some other organizations in the space that we partner with. And then we see some providers up there on the top left. Camunda should be up there as well, actually, I made a mistake there. R3 is the provider of the distributed ledger technology. Accenture's helped us on the platform build, and then EY is doing our security and audit work. So now you do recognize some of these brands, right? So that's kind of stepping forward into what's important there. So what are we doing and why? So as I said, there's a lot of waste, from a board of directors type position. They'd say there's a lot of locked up capital in the insurance industry, handling business processes that could be handled more efficiently. And McKinsey described it recently as insurance companies are islands. So just as you'd imagine, islands in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, separated by large stretches of ocean. These companies have, huge numbers of employees dedicated just to interacting with each other in very manual processes. And so our first goal, the first wave, is to take a look at existing processes and say, okay, how can we handle these better? And depending on who you talk to, there are up to tens of billions of dollars of locked-in capital that we can help our consortium members release to deploy in more interesting things. Next wave after doing some of these things would be what we'd think of as new products. So you've probably heard more about sort of new and innovative products when you hear about DLT and blockchain and startups around that. But the first big push in the industry is actually, let's get efficient first, and then that gives us a platform to then innovate further on top of that. In fact, the first use cases that we're going to market with, and the very first of those is what's called first notice of loss, just to give you an example of what I'm talking about. So in the claims process, if you have an accident, we're talking private passenger auto now, which is just one subsector of property and casualty, and you contact your insurance company, and maybe there's more than one party involved, just that currently is a very inefficient process. So being able to share that process between member companies is quite a dramatic cost savings. So that's just one example there. So how do we do this? So we talked about the fact that we're a consortium, right? So we're forming a network of companies, and networks consist of a group of nodes, and so that's what this represents. So our software we call Canopy, and there's a stack which makes up Canopy. It runs on a network of nodes. So very high level conceptually, let's call these member companies A through F. And these companies will have their presence on the network, that's the node, and then there'll be integration to their back office systems. And really key concept, so why are we doing this with a distributed ledger? Why are we not doing it with some other technology, like a really easy thing like a centralized database? Two things here. So you use distributed ledger or blockchain in what are termed trustless environments. Now that would probably offend the insurance companies if they were here in the room or if they're watching later. But there's this notion of, okay, so I've got what I recorded on my side of the transaction, but are you seeing the same thing, or have you changed it and then not informed me? What's going on here? And so when you're dealing with a shared business process, it's really, really important that we are both seeing the same thing. So that's what distributed ledger fundamentally allows you to do. And it does that through the use of PKI, which I won't go into here, but the 4 core concepts of PKI apply very clearly here. So confidentiality, authentication, integrity, and non-repudiation. And I like the last one the best, which is, no, you really did say that. You can't take that back later. And so in this semi-trusting environment, then I shouldn't say trustless perhaps, this is a way for the insurance companies to know exactly what's going on, what the state is in these shared processes. So digging in a little bit further. So what's running on one of these nodes? So very simply, 3 layers. The bottom layer I've talked about very briefly. Distributed ledger layer, then we have a control framework layer. I'll get into the reason why we have that, and an integration layer. And then there are some other services as well. So for anybody that knows anything about DLT or blockchain, we're running a private permission network, and we're running that on a DLT technology called Corda, and so there are some other things there. So to validate transactions, Corda uses a notary service. So RiskStream manages the notary for the network, and then we also manage a network map. So it's private and permissioned. Node only gets access if we actually grant that node access, and that's how you get your keys, and that's how you can participate in the network. Okay? So a bit more detail. We'll dig in here. Watch my time. Okay. So bottom layer, what are we doing? So the distributed ledger layer, this is what I really think of as data persistence. Now, it's going to get interesting for where Camunda comes in a moment, so just bear with me there. Again, anyone that's familiar with DLT or blockchain, you'll be familiar with this notion of distributed applications, okay? So we are using the distributed applications just for the logic that's needed for data persistence. So again, what I see, what you see, what any other parties see is all the same, okay? And that's running on Corda. The reason that we use, and messaging between nodes is using Apache Artemis, now known as Apache ActiveMQ. The reason that we use Corda is because of their privacy model. Privacy is extremely important to our member companies. Not just encryption, but privacy in itself. And again, I'll spend just 10 seconds on this slide. In a typical, public type blockchain, like an Ethereum model, they have what's termed a gossip protocol. So if any 2 parties enter into a transaction, then even though that's encrypted, there's metadata out there. Other parties know that you were involved in that. And in particular, because there are asymmetries in the participation in the insurance market, and there are a limited number of companies, you could actually quickly reverse engineer out, okay, so who are these nodes and who's doing what level of business with each other? So that model didn't work for them. In Corda, only the parties to that transaction know that that transaction ever happened. So that's fundamentally different. So it's fundamentally private. For, again, any DLT or blockchain nerds in the room, I'm one of them, you could use, completely anonymizing protocols and things like that, but unfortunately they're too slow for practical use currently. So we're going with this model. So this is where Camunda comes in. So we talked about the base layer for data persistence, and we're using Camunda to model the majority of the business process logic. And that's really important because this actually serves as an abstraction layer for us. Okay, and again, you guys know about Camunda, so I won't go into all the details here. But one of the challenges that we've been presented, and we won't be doing this with our first live implementation, but we think it's definitely within the next 12 months for us, is what happens when you have to actually bridge a business process across multiple blockchains or multiple DLT-type technologies. Okay, that's a hard thing to do. So again, anybody that's been out there and involved in this will know that. And so this leaves the door open for us to use Camunda not only to model the business process on one ledger, but also to act as a state machine so that we can do handoff of business processes between multiple ledgers on multiple blockchains. And that's really interesting for our members because there are some interesting dynamics out there where we are one large consortium. We like to think of ourselves as the Uber consortium. But there are smaller groups of participants who've done interesting things in different parts of the insurance world. And at some point, we'd like to integrate those into what we're doing. And so we'll need this capability. Okay, so we're using it as this business process layer and also, importantly, as an abstraction layer. And then our top layer, as the name suggests, integration layer, it integrates into stuff. So it secures our API endpoints. We have adapters into various important back office systems. And there's also a notification hub, which we won't get into. And then one other thing, which I didn't cover there, just in my footnote there. Down at the core app level, interesting stuff. So the core app's written in Kotlin. Anyone's not interested, has not read up on that. That's an interesting language, sort of a Java variant, but with bells on it. And then Java and Spring Boot, pretty standard stuff up at the API layer. Okay, so actually whipping through this pretty quickly. More time for questions at the end, right? So what are some of the challenges that we've run into? This is actually probably some of the more interesting stuff fundamentally. So we're a consortium, right? And I often joke with folks that slow is the new fast when it comes to leading a consortium. So we're not a software vendor. And by definition, unless you can actually work with folks to get onto this network and adopt this principle of working in this shared network, then you're not going to go anywhere, right? So it's like pushing on a piece of string. So you can make the network as attractive as possible, but you can't push people onto it. So lots and lots of challenges around that. One of the challenges working with the insurance industry is that you will be working with innovation teams first and understanding their innovation processes. And this probably is similar across large financial institutions and other folks out there. So if you're coming from a startup background, you're trying to figure out how to interact with these companies, go talk to the innovation teams first, but then it can actually be quite difficult to get out of the innovation team over to the business side, right? Because the innovation team is the birthing area, but then actually to go into production, you have a whole different set of controls. So you have not been successful necessarily if you've made friends on the innovation team, and you have to go through all the cycle to actually get over into production, which is interesting. Navigating network dynamics is a challenge. So anytime you have a shared business process, the first few folks who are maybe technically ready, they're going to say, so why should I get on the network? Network value is 0 with one participant. I'm only automating my own process. So, but then the nice thing is that, it's an n-squared increase in value as more and more people get on the network. So one of the things that we found is, our most enthusiastic early members aren't necessarily the ones who will actually do business with each other on the network. Right? So that's another set of issues. So we are very carefully working through that and nudging and encouraging the right folks who have an overlap in business to get on the network first, and then it will coalesce from there. So issues there. The top right thing up here, antitrust concerns. In the US, you have to be extraordinarily careful when you get a group of representatives from insurance companies together in one room. Extremely careful. That's actually an antitrust statement that's up there, and we have to make sure that all of our members read that at the beginning of every single group meeting, whether that's a conference call, a web demo, or especially in person, because there are very strict laws in the US. And the laws are there, of course, because in the past this stuff was abused, but you have to be very careful. So insurance companies can't just get together and start to talk about some of these things which may relate to pricing or how they measure risk or do things like that, because the feds will come after them. So we have to navigate that as well as we go through this. Bottom left, risk management industry also means risk-averse industry. So insurance is actually, I would say over the next 5 to 10 years, it's going to be an incredibly lucrative space for startups to be in, because there is so much potential transformation that will happen there. And the very senior executives are very aware of it, and they're trying to figure out how to do it. They also have tremendous problems with staffing in that industry. So I think the average age within most insurance companies is around 55. And so, the older I get, of course, the more I think that's just a young age. But definitely a challenge for them. They're not able to bring in staff easily to do these things, and so automation is going to be critical for them. Disillusionment, that curve there, which you can probably barely read, is the Gartner hype cycle. So as we've gone through this over multiple years, we've definitely gone through the peak of hype where we were getting invited along to conferences, just a few years ago. So if anybody here ever attended Consensus or one of those big conferences, this Consensus New York City a couple of years ago, there were lines of Lamborghinis parked outside the building, okay? And the hashtags were crypto Lambo moon, okay? So there was so much hype around cryptocurrencies and all the rest of it that actual real applications got lost in the noise. And in fact, many times when we talk to senior executives, they'd say, do you have anything to do with cryptocurrencies? And our first answer had better be no, right? Because that polluted so much of the discussion. Over time, I think there's scope for discussion around that, but right now it's about efficiency. And then time and money. Thankfully, the Institutes has the capital to be patient, and their board of directors, being senior executives in the insurance industry, they're also, let me say, they have appropriate insights into how fast their companies can change. And so, therefore, we have that level of support. So we've been at this, depending on how you count it, for at least 4 years. Heading into our 5th year, and these are some of the work streams that we've got out there, again, just to give you an idea of how all this ties together. So in terms of use cases, so whether it be first notice of loss or proof of insurance or any one of a range of 100+ other use cases that are out there, that's one of the more mature parts, as is the bottom work stream on governance, because again, we're a consortium, so you better make sure that you have your boards sorted out, advisory boards. I'm the chair of the technical committee, for example. There's a use case strategy committee. There are these other governance structures in place. Those have to function well. And then, as you can see, 2017, we started off by doing some proofs of concept on Ethereum. We weren't using Camunda at the time, so we shelved those. Now we're using Camunda, right? The platform, we started working with Accenture on that in 2018, so it was fairly early on when we made the design decision to use Camunda. We've been very happy with that since. We would consider our technology and our platform to be production ready at this point. Still is some work to be done in order to integrate it into our members' security environments. So in fact, this afternoon we'll be talking to an HSM provider and getting some information locked down on that. Similarly, on the infrastructure, went from historically using AWS, we're now using AWS and Azure, soon we'll be implementing on Google Cloud as well, but figuring out, cross-cloud architecture is interesting. One of the really nice things about Camunda is that it has not caused us any issues in any of the cloud environments. It's been great just to be able to deploy that in an embedded fashion and not worry about it. Member testing is ongoing, and that will continue to go on as we work through this. There's a whole additional discussion on that. And then finally, the security and privacy and risk review. We're engaged heavily with our members on that currently. And so we're working through that. As I said, this is one of the biggest challenges going from innovation sandboxes to actual production, is that you will have to work through, with every one of these companies, the CISO team review, which is necessarily challenging, and it should be that way, right? Because you have to get over that bar. And this is where Ernst & Young has been working with us to do that. They've reviewed our whole stack, and again, there have been some really interesting findings which they came back with. They used this as sort of a benchmark study as they work with other clients doing this kind of work. And one of the most interesting things we've had to go through is really an education cycle with these different CISO teams, because if you're dealing with distributed networks, distributed business processes between companies, that threat model looks substantially different than anything the CISO teams will have looked at previously. So it doesn't matter whether you're using distributed ledger or whether you're using Camunda natively, if you're handling business processes that span multiple organizations and they have good security teams, there'll be an education cycle for you. They're used to looking at 3-tier architectures, and this notion of sharing data, sharing business processes, it will really bend their minds for a while. But we've been getting through that. People are very receptive. And so that's where we are. We expect, fingers crossed, live dates in early 2020. Again, very dependent on members, but this is how we're using Camunda as part of our stack. It's been a really interesting journey, and definitely been very, very easy to work with these guys, whether we've needed consulting support along the way or other architectural advice. Currently, we have not had to run it at high load yet because we're still in test. We'll do some sort of million transaction type loads now in Q4, just to make sure that we're stress testing appropriately. And in fact, we'll probably, for the most demanding use cases that we're looking at, we'll only be looking at tens of millions of transactions a year per use case. But again, well within the capabilities of Camunda. I liked that earlier you mentioned the Goldman Sachs case. I think they're up to hundreds of millions of transactions a day now in their infrastructure. So that was a great benchmark for us to see early on in the evaluation. But that's it from me today. So any questions? Like I said, if they get hard, I'll probably ask Anir, but I'll see what I can do. Go ahead.
One question. Do you have any public paper how you build your technical solutions with both this?
I'm sorry, can you repeat?
Do you have any public papers that can be read?
I'm sorry.
Public papers?
Oh, have we publicized any papers?
Yes.
No, we have not published any papers on it. I would like to, but we have to respect the wishes.
It's a similar problem for different companies, different industries. So we'll be glad to get some.
Sure. Yeah, let's talk afterwards and we'll see what we can share.
Different companies have different risk levels. How do you manage that? In the sense, you can have a common ledger, but as an insurance company, I'm willing to take a better risk.
So there are many. There is a whole risk spectrum. Okay, we're dealing with very specific use cases, and we're building with a use case focus. So, for example, first notice of loss in private passenger auto is a very well-defined use case, which any company in the US that offers auto insurance will be familiar with. Because again, if several of us are involved in a multi-vehicle accident, we all call our insurance companies. They know how to handle it. They all call each other, and they know what that process looks like. We're just taking that from a very manual process, and then we're automating it. And so each time we look at a new use case like that, and again, it could be first notice of loss, it could be a presentation of a proof of insurance. So there are quite high fraud rates in terms of insurance where people will take out an insurance policy, then immediately cancel it, but now they have the insurance card. So actually, for a law enforcement officer or for somebody trying to figure out, is this insurance valid, is a hard problem. That's something that we'll be looking at. But each one of these is a very tightly defined use case. So this wouldn't be used just for, random risk events.
Although there is no common ledger, actually, because each insurance company has its own ledger.
Yes. Thanks, Nir. That's a good point also. There's no central ledger. Yeah.
I have a question about how they go from use cases to defining workflows.
So some of this is just a language piece. So That I would say is we go from an ideation phase within working groups. So we will work through a whole decision process on what should be the next use case for RiskStream. We form a working group around that. The working group involves multiple insurance companies that will collectively map that business process. Once we've mapped that business process, then we can go to implementation in Camunda. And actually, after this morning's presentation, Anira and myself were talking about the fact that it would be great to start to use Kawemo to actually involve the insurance companies more in live modeling and live sharing of that. But there is a whole process that goes from the ideation over which process next through to defining it, through PowerPoint, through meetings, and then actually mapping it at that point. Sure. Anybody else? Okay. Well, I'll be around afterwards if there are more specific questions, but thanks for your patience.